amount of registration. I'll mention that we're recording this and we will then post it later in the future as well. So as I was saying, delighted to see such a great registration and a turnout for this event, and it'll be nice to be able to put the conversation up online as well in the future. It's a really great to have a member briefing. It's one of the nice benefits of being a member of Media Impact Funders. Our members here at American Journalism Project and the Lumina Foundation are our co-hosts for this. And if you are a member of the organization of Media Impact Funders and would like to host one of these, please let us know. Contact Roshni or any of us to suggest an idea for it. And if you're not a member already but would like to do this, you might want to be in touch with Katie Resch, our Director of Member Engagement, to become a member as well. And it's just such an exciting time to be having this conversation in this moment. For ourselves here at Media Impact Funders, we recently released a report under the direction of Jennifer Preston, formerly VP at the Knight Foundation, in partnership with NORC at the University of Chicago and our partners at the Lenfest Institute for Journalism. And the bottom line of that report is to show that this is a large and growing field. There continue to be issues of ethics and disclosure that we all need to attend to, but I think most optimistically is showing that most of the people we surveyed are active in funding media and journalism. They've been increasing their dollars, and there are important new faces in support of journalism. So that's exciting. And if you want to learn more about that, Jennifer is going to be presenting that at our monthly Journalism Funders Network Zoom, which takes place just next Monday. We'll, I think, post a link to that as well if you want to circle back and hear more about that research. And then I would just say, in this particular moment also, unless you've been sleeping under a rock or in an extremely long summer vacation that's extended into September, you might have missed it, but there was a big announcement last week of the Press Forward initiative, which is a campaign for $500 million or more in new money for local journalism. And so there's a lot of excitement, I think, in the field for that. And it will be great to bring new players to the field as well. But some of us and some of the people, in particular at the American Journalism Project, have been fighting this battle for several years now and have been doing a really amazing job at leading in the vanguard of addressing the crisis in local news. And we have with us to lead the discussion today, Sarabeth Berman, the CEO at the American Journalism Project, to take it away and lead today's discussion. And then I'll talk to you all at the end of this panel discussion. So thank you, Sarabeth, for co-hosting this event with us.
Great. Thank you so much, Vince, and all the folks at Media Impact Funders. We are really thrilled to be able to co-host this event today. I think we're going to have a really interesting hour. We are in a good old-fashioned Zoom, not a webinar Zoom. So if you can come on camera, it's always nice to see your faces, and we would love to have a conversation and hear from you throughout. So feel free to, as we go, drop questions in, come off mute. I think a lot of you, our topic today, a lot of you are really working on, and so we want to hear from you. I will turn to introducing our panelists in just a moment, but why don't I first, for those of you who aren't acquainted, just briefly introduce the American Journalism Project. We call ourselves a venture philanthropy, and we're focused on rebuilding local news across the country and specifically focused on nonprofit local news. What this means is that we rally philanthropic dollars and we use those dollars to build and grow sustainable nonprofit news organizations. We have a really laser focus on sustainability, building organizations that can endure over the long term. We really see our role as trying to usher in a new way of financing local news in this country as nonprofit organizations, that we finance in the way we do other civic institutions that help our communities flourish. We make investments in existing organizations. We also help to incubate new organizations. We now have a portfolio of 41 grantee newsrooms from Mississippi to Montana. We've committed over $42 million to those organizations. But in addition to direct investments, we've helped to mobilize close to $60 million of local philanthropy to launch market-specific, what we call local news initiatives. And as part of this program, we've worked with civic leaders, place-based funders, and news organizations to really understand the information gaps in communities, and then work to develop solutions for how to deploy philanthropic dollars to address the problems we are identifying and the opportunities in front of us. We've done this in about 10 communities across the country to date. I see Courtney Bankston on this call. We did this in Wichita, where we worked with the Wichita Foundation, and this resulted in them making their single largest discretionary grant ever into the local news ecosystem there in Wichita. Some of you may have followed the launch of Houston Landing, which was the result of a similar program, $20 million of local philanthropy, the Houston Endowment, Richard and Nancy Kinder, Arnold Ventures investing in addressing the local news gaps there in Houston. Similarly, in Ohio, the Cleveland Foundation and other leading Ohio-based funders launched Signal Cleveland, and later this year, with the help of Knight Foundation and other local funders, they'll be launching Signal Akron. So we're seeing a lot of momentum around significant capital coming together in local communities to address the local news crisis. And one of the really exciting initiatives that is coming together and is going to be the focus of our conversation today is an effort in Indiana currently called the Indiana Local News Initiative. So I'm going to turn to introducing our great panelists, and we're going to use this Indiana Local News Initiative as a case study for how we're seeing these efforts to ignite local philanthropy come together. First, I will introduce the great Lauren Williams here. She has the capital B background there, waving. She is the CEO and co-founder of Capital B, which focuses on reporting for Black communities across the country. Formerly, she was the editor-in-chief at Vox. We had the great privilege of getting to work with Lauren in 2020 when she came to us with this idea, and we gave her first capital and got to work alongside her and watch Lauren and her co-founder Akoto launch Capital B, and they are headed to Gary, Indiana later this year, and that is how they plug into this Indiana Local News Initiative. Kevin Corcoran, who's the communications strategy director at Lumina Foundation and a leader in funding in the Indiana Local News Initiative. He is a longtime newspaper reporter for more than 20 years, including as an investigative reporter at the Indianapolis Star. So he knows Indiana local news better than most. And we also have Michael Ouimette, who is the Chief Investment Officer at AJP, which means he oversees our programmatic work, our investments in our portfolio. But for the purposes of this conversation, Michael has built alongside his team our local philanthropy partnerships program, where we have been working with local philanthropy to make some really significant investments in local news. So again, please drop questions in the chat as we go. Happy to pull people into this conversation. I'm seeing Lizzie Hazeltine from North Carolina, who works on similar issues, and Allison, who's been working in Delaware on similar. So lots of people with good thinking to pull into this conversation. All right, I'm going to get us started. So Michael, why don't you just frame up for us what the Indiana Local News Initiative is and how it came about?
Sure, would be happy to, and would encourage my partners Lauren and Kevin, who are leaders in this, to expand upon this and their answers. So about 2.5 years ago, a group of individuals and institutional philanthropies kind of got together in Indiana and wanted to rigorously study the state of local news and democracy in Indiana. And in conversations with those individuals, with Lumina Foundation and with the Indianapolis Foundation, we formed a steering committee to do a year-long research effort that was statewide. And we knew it was really important to do this work statewide, knowing that so many issues related to public policy and the state government and the kind of gaps in the news ecosystem were not just in Indianapolis, which of course has a ton of philanthropy and a ton of local news, but also in the other parts of the state as well. That research involved speaking to nearly 1,000 Hoosiers between focus groups, interviews, surveys, and also taking a hard look at the state of media, knowing that like in all areas of the country, Indiana's local news ecosystem has changed drastically in the last generation. After that year and kind of in conversations with the steering committee, we identified 4 gaps that in terms of a intervention by private philanthropy in strengthening local news ecosystems would be the most urgent and would have the highest impact. Those 4 areas were Indianapolis, Northwest Indiana and Gary in particular, rural Indiana, and the kind of coverage of state government and statewide policy issues. And can speak more about kind of how that happened and what the analysis was that led to that. In response to the research and those 4 priorities, the Indiana Local News Initiative was founded as a new nonprofit to do 3 things. First, to fill gaps in the local news ecosystem on a prioritized basis with nonprofit local newsrooms that were community-driven and responsive to the gaps identified in the research. Second, to facilitate investment from local and national philanthropies to existing media outlets that had a great track record of impact and a plan to grow their original reporting in ways that were consistent with the gaps found in the research. And finally, to foster collaboration with the broad ecosystem of media outlets in Indiana, knowing that with more collaboration, those news gaps could be better addressed for the benefit of Hoosiers. That kind of led us to seek support from philanthropy. We have now altogether raised over $11 million across those priority areas, and kind of a couple across, maybe half a dozen different interventions in the local news landscape in Indiana. Later, and those have sort of been coming online over the course of this year. We recently announced a great journalist, Oshia Boyd, leading up a 20-person Indianapolis-focused newsroom. Capital B Gary is also forming as part of this initiative, and I know Lauren is going to speak to that. And about 5 other Indiana news outlets, including State House File and the Indianapolis Recorder, have also added to their capacity this year as part of the local news initiative. So it's been an exciting 2.5-year journey. It's been most exciting this year to see parts of the plan come online successively. And we know that, altogether with the more than 36 local journalism jobs that have been created across the state, it's going to be a great time for the local news ecosystem in Indiana.
Thank you. Lauren, you started Capital B in 2021. Tell us about why you started it, what you were trying to build, and how does this decision to launch in Gary, Indiana, fit into that vision?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm just so pleased to be here, to be a part of this initiative. And as always and forever, so thankful for the support of AJP and of Lumina in getting here into this place. So in really the idea for Capital B happened in 2020. I was the editor-in-chief of Vox at the time. My co-founder, Akoto, was the managing editor at The Trace. And it was the middle of the George Floyd protests, and we were all, sort of newly on COVID lockdown, and everything was very, very difficult for everyone everywhere. And we, as our sort of journalism industry at large was having its racial reckoning, Akoto and I were surveying what we were seeing in the industry. What we were all seeing was the decline of local news, the business problems of commercial media, both locally and nationally, but also personally, the issues that we had experienced as Black journalists, as Black leaders, and all of those things really came to a head for us in that moment. And we thought about what we could offer to the industry that we weren't seeing, how we could fill the holes. And we also thought about who was being left behind the most in this moment. And we worried a lot about Black audiences. And so we sat down and we came up with a concept for a news organization that was going to serve Black audiences, that was going to be sustainable, that was going to scale, and that was going to cover local news and fill some of these holes that have existed forever, but are worsening in this environment. And so that is how Capital B was born, a local and national news organization serving Black audiences around the country with centralized business, a centralized audience, and some centralized editorial services that would support a local news network, would build communities around the country with Capital B Atlanta. Beginning, when we thought about the kinds of communities that we wanted to have newsrooms in, it was never that we only wanted to be in places like Atlanta, big, huge populations, to serve underserved Black communities. And so when we sat down and made, I wish I could call it a short list, it's a very long list of places where we wanted to bring Capital B, it was your Atlantas, it was your big cities like that, but it was also places like Buffalo, it was places like Gary, it was necessarily have a ton of local funding, or wouldn't have a big, huge audience that was going to be able to pad out our metrics, but would be a part of this mission that we'd be able to serve, and that through our national fundraising we'd be able to supplement. And so Gary absolutely always fit in to what we were trying to do. I think when we'll talk about this a little later, I think, at the very beginning, we had, a misconception around how we might fundraise in Gary, or how we might fundraise for Gary. But a place like Gary was always part of what we wanted to do with Capital B.
Great. Kevin, so you are a member of Media Impact Funders, you fund journalism, but the reality is that Lumina Foundation is a higher education foundation. So tell us a little bit about how you think about journalism funding more broadly, and then also why you ended up getting very involved in this specific initiative in Indiana.
Yeah, thanks, Sarabeth. So as you said, we really focus, most of our work is around higher ed and workforce, and really trying to raise the overall education level of the country, and particularly among students who don't get a lot of attention in institutions that aren't that aren't always in the news. We also have a civic commitment, to Indiana, as Indianapolis in particular as our base of operation. We ended up we actually funded Capital B initially out of our Racial Justice and Equity Fund, which we expanded after George Floyd's murder. And Lauren and her team came to us, and with their idea, we really liked it, and we put some seed capital into it. And at that point, the Gary idea was actually not in the picture on the radar screen. We just funded it as part of a larger sort of national effort. And we got involved with American Journalism Project. We don't have, as you said, we're not primarily a journalism funder, so we didn't have the kind of capital that a lot of foundations put into AJP initially. But we were interested in learning from the work that AJP was doing at the local level, and trying to draw lessons from that we could share with the national media organizations that we fund, and some of the place-based organizations that we fund in California and Texas, and in Colorado, other states, Indiana. And so we made what we call a learning investment, which was just a modest amount to sort of be in conversation with AJP. And we ended up basically having some civic leaders here who were concerned about the state of local journalism, found AJP, and I think entered into discussion with you, and that led to the landscape study that Michael was talking about, which Lumina initially funded. And I think it's a little bit outside of what we would normally do, but we were interested, and I had a discussion with our CEO, Jamie Marasotis, and we agreed that this is something that Lumina should be involved in. We had some money in our budget and communications to do it, so we put that in. But we also recognized, we live in Indiana, so we kind of know what the landscape is, and we recognized that AJP was going to find a lot of need there, and that there was going to be a follow-up discussion about perhaps funding a new a startup, or two startups in this case, the operation up in Gary, and also the Indianapolis newsroom, along with a couple other pieces that we funded around rural radio and state house coverage. And so, we see the value of journalism for the work that we do at the foundation. And so part of, how we talk about this with other local funders is helping them understand that we see this as foundational and fundamental to the programmatic efforts that we have underway at the foundation, and the policy outreach that we're doing. The media coverage can essentially increase people's awareness and understanding of what problems are out there and what potential solutions might look like. And so because we think it's so important, over time, we've basically come to the point where we have about half of our $16 million 2-year comms budget is allocated towards media. A year ago, we hired a program officer, Stephanie Wong, who's on this call, who's essentially dedicated to leading that work. So even though we don't see ourselves as a foundation that's primarily about funding journalism, or even it's not it's not part of our programmatic push, everybody within the foundation and our senior leadership and among our colleagues on the program and policy side, they can see the value of this. I apologize for the light going off. I'm in a LEED certified building, so if I don't move enough, then the lights go out. So I'll move here in a second. And
good for the planet.
Yeah, it is good for the planet. Maybe not as good for this presentation. But so it started out as a learning investment for us. I think we saw it as a civic obligation, something that really Lumina should be involved in. Locally, we are not the big dog, and Indiana is not our primary focus, but we are more willing, I think, to see possibilities, and things that don't exist yet, and help to build things. And so that's essentially how we got involved. And I think it helped that efforts like Signal Cleveland and Houston Landing were underway, and we could point to those, the work other work in the Midwest. So anyway, that's essentially why we're part of this.
Great, Kevin. Why don't I stay with you for one moment? When this initiative announced, it announced with $10 million of capital raised for this initiative. I believe now it's a little bit over $11 million that's been raised. Most of that is local. AJP has come in with about $2 million as part of that fundraise. What do you think led to this moment where significant capital was coming together? What did you find surprising about this initiative or interesting about this initiative? You've certainly been around local journalism in Indiana for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing that struck me was just the ambition behind it. I mean, it's it's a big idea. It's supported by evidence. So we went out and showed, sort of, here's the news that Indiana needs, and here's what's missing. I think people can see the sort of decline of the for-profit model locally, and also sort of the over-reliance, I would say, in Indiana on Gannett properties, and some of the challenges that they're facing, and and the for-profit model is facing. And I think people, there are a lot of people, individuals who are high net worth individuals who see journalism as a public good and something that can help bring the community together. And so I think that stimulated interest. I think there were foundations locally who were more comfortable funding journalism. So Nina Mason Pulliam Trust, for example, was a big contributor. Their money comes from the Pulliam family, which owned the Indianapolis Star and the Arizona Republic. And and there have been some other local funders who put money in. Joyce Foundation was a co-funder with us in the initial co-funding of the Capital B. Gary. And so I think as a recognition of a problem, there's a lot more sales work to be done. I mean, there are local funders who I think could bring even bigger dollars, who just need to see proof of concept. And so at Lumina, we like to say we're a high engagement partner. And so, as because we're high engagement with you, we have a lot of questions and ideas about how we could position this so that it's attractive to other funders who are more in the space of Indiana and Indianapolis even than Lumina is, and have who are not quite there yet. I think AJP's track record helped. I mean, so you've got something, there's a lot of work that you've done around what I call point solutions. So you've worked with a lot of these local entities, and you've learned things that could be applied in a sort of ecosystem context. And I think that was appealing and attractive. And it helped, I think, that we've got people at the local level who are not necessarily people you would associate with journalism, who've come in and said this is important. So we got Mark Miles, who runs the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, Karen Fusen, who used to be the publisher at the Star. We've got Myrta Pulliam, who was part of the family that owned the newspaper and has become concerned about the current state of journalism locally. So I think it's a mixture of concern. I think it does help to have some first movers, and Lumina has learned that over time. We don't currently fund, for example, Chalkbeat Indiana, but we did help it get it started because we saw the value in it. And being able to say that Lumina was part of that helped them locally to raise money. So it's a combination of factors, but I think there we're at a moment in time, which I think is what Press Forward is capturing, where there's a lot of concern about the future of democracy and local communities and the strength of people's relationships and how people are getting along. Communities that have never been covered. So when I was at the Times of Northwest Indiana, which includes Gary as part of its area of coverage, I mean, we were explicitly told that we don't cover Gary. And, that has been the attitude. The paper that did cover Gary has moved out of Gary, into a, wider community. And so I was very excited about the idea of Capital B. Gary. And I think Michael knew when he put that on the table that we'd be pretty excited about that. Probably didn't realize how excited, but I think we really want to help that effort flourish and succeed. We were already doing work with Public News Service, so we were kind of glad to be able to bring them into Indiana. They've hired 2 people to, start putting together a rural radio report. More and more colleges and universities are playing a role in coverage locally, and the State House Files no exception. So Franklin College has set that up as an experiential learning thing, but now it's grown into a statewide news bureau. So a lot of things, at once. I will say the press forward advent of that was actually fortuitous, I think, for the local news initiative, because it allows Lumina, because we're participating in that, we're going to be involved in the local news and that initiative more deeply and for over a longer period of time. So in addition to the 11 million that's been raised, I know that we'll be able to put quite a bit more into the effort because we're participating in press forward and making aligned investments.
Music to our ears. Michael, I'm curious if you have anything to add, you and your team. I saw Hermione Malone was on this call earlier. I know she had to leave for another call, but who works closely with Michael on our local philanthropy partnerships, have been working across the country with local philanthropists, but specifically in Indiana. I'm curious what you're finding in Indiana as it relates to sort of what was galvanizing folks to come in.
Sure. I think it's a couple elements, and certainly would echo the ones that Kevin shared. I think having a broad coalition of local stewards who were not from the journalism community was really essential in communicating to philanthropy. This is not fundamentally about journalism. This is fundamentally about making Indiana a better place and really communicating, whether it's from a democracy perspective or you're an environmental funder or a health funder, or whatever it may be, making sure there is local news on those topics has to be part of your strategy if it's to be successful. And having those local stewards to communicate that was really essential. I'd also say the rigor and complexity of the research, but also the solution set, I think is also, it's helpful in that it kind of really underscores this is about reimagining and building the local news ecosystem that we need. This is not about any one outlet. This is not about any one part of the ecosystem. Of course, with complexity comes, more donor education and philanthropy education that is required. And Kevin and Stephanie have been incredibly helpful in that as well. I would say is another piece of it as well.
Great. Lauren, so I think a lot of people can imagine how you might fund Capital B in a place like Atlanta, but it's harder to imagine how it works in a place like Gary that's very low income. And so I think it'd be helpful to hear a little bit about how you think about fundraising in Gary and what you've been finding.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Kevin hit the nail on the head a little bit. I mean, we have, through the partnership, through the opportunities presented by the partnership, raised enough money to get Gary off the ground and to sustain it for quite some time. And what the challenge is moving forward is to show the hyper local funders on the ground that we're legit and we're here to stay and actually launch and show them the type of work that we're going to do. And, I think Gary in particular is a community that has been really neglected and burned by the media, really only covered if something terrible has happened. And when we're out there talking to folks, they, the first thing they ask us is like, where's your office? Because they're like, are you from Chicago, or are you here? Are you actually like settling in here? Because there's just we're outsiders. There's a lack of trust. And I think what we really have to show is that we're here and we're here to stay. And, so it's building those relationships and, like Kevin said, showing a proof of concept. but everyone that we've talked to is very intrigued and very excited. But when you are coming in to a community, a very, insular community like that, like it does takes a little bit of time. But I also think, broadly, the way that we were thinking about coming into Gary was that we were not going to be able to come to Gary if we ever, because Gary had always been on our long list, right? And when we were thinking about when we would one day come to Gary, it was that we were going to come to Gary with like money, Gen Ops money that we had set aside for, newsrooms that we weren't going to be able to raise money for, right? And the fact that through this initiative we were able to actually raise money, for specifically for the Gary newsroom was very much outside of our imagination when we were first conceiving of Capital B, and I think has really opened our eyes to the possibilities of fundraising for local newsrooms in places that are maybe more off the beaten path and outside of, the big cities. And in fact, raising money in the big cities is not necessarily a piece of cake locally. And so I think it is the model here is, fundraising for local newsrooms is I think it's changing and evolving, and it's really opened our eyes to some of the possibilities for the future for Capital B newsrooms for sure.
Great. I do want to encourage folks to ask questions in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function if you want, and I'm happy to call you in. Michael, give us a status update on the Indiana Local News Initiative now. So we're now in the phase of kind of taking philanthropy and turning that into sustainable journalism. So where are we in that path?
Absolutely. So I think, and kind of building off my last answer, I think what was also appreciated by philanthropy is the rigor around not being duplicative and really filling gaps across the 4 areas that we found. And want to acknowledge the Lumina Foundation for being the sole institutional philanthropy that actually contributed to all 4 of those gaps. I think it's important, in terms of working with philanthropy to have kind of a menu of available options that most fits with their strategy. But of course, it's always great when all 4 did fit within Lumina's strategy. So there are progress points in all 4. We've made the kind of most progress, I would say, on the in Gary with the upcoming launch of Capital B Gary. It's also an exciting time in Indianapolis with the hiring, like I mentioned before, of Oshia Boyd, who is currently hiring an additional 20 journalists in Indianapolis. The Indianapolis Recorder has also been able to grow their staff by 4 people as well. Those, in addition to the increase in staff in the organizations that serve rural Indiana and kind of the state government gap that Kevin mentioned, are all now, working on, okay, so we have an increase in our resources. What is the best way for us to collaborate on a consistent basis to make sure we are serving underserved local news audiences? And, the initiative will kind of have upcoming announcements about those in the coming months as well.
Great. Lauren, I'm going to turn to Vince's question in just a minute. Lauren, you have, let's get a status update from you also. So you've already started hiring your editorial team in Gary. You're getting ready to go live. So what kind of journalism can we expect to see? What are you thinking is going to be challenging about this? And what are you seeing as the opportunities as you're getting closer and closer to publishing?
Yeah. So I'm biased, but I'm so thrilled and excited about Capital B Gary. It's going to be good. We have our editor and our community engagement editor hired. We have just made offers for 2 of our reporter positions, and so the newsroom is really shaping up. I can compare it to Capital B Atlanta and the opportunities and challenges there. Capital B Atlanta is, Atlanta is such a huge city, and what we found hard with a smaller newsroom was, basically wrapping our arms around all of the news. And I think what is really exciting about Gary, particularly when there is such a lack of other news organizations there, is that it's wide open. The opportunities for coverage are wide open. Our community engagement editor is going to council meetings, and there is no other media there, literally no other media at any of the meetings. And so the opportunities for us to provide necessary news and information to the residents of Gary are endless, because literally nobody is doing it. So I'm just so excited for us to be there and start doing that. We're serving our potential audiences now, and what we can expect out of our journalism is going to be very community informed, very responsive to people's current burning questions about their communities and what's happening. So we're really currently trying to really understand what folks most want to know and understand. And that's how we'll be starting out at the gate.
Great. Vince, can I turn to you to ask your question? And then Lori, I'm eager to bring you in.
Yeah, sure. I was just wondering, what is for AJP, do you go into a community with a definite time, 5 years, 10 years, or is it, does it differ from community to community? How long do these engagements last?
Michael, why don't you go ahead and take that one?
Sure. I think it does differ by community, but I think let me speak a bit to the mindsets about how we think about that. I think we come at this from the perspective that, the work of, building local news ecosystems, strengthening nonprofit news outlets, growing new ones is very hard. And it takes, requires, a consistent engagement for many years. And we have kind of made sure to structure our programs to acknowledge that. So I mentioned before we started our work in Indiana in 2021, we are already, committed to working, in terms of our grant funding and our program staff through the end of 2026, kind of based on how our cycles work. So that's, I think for a project like this that really examines community information needs, imagines what a new kind of reimagined ecosystem could look like, through to the stage of sustainability, which, as you know, is a focus of the American Journalism Project. That's going to take 5 years. There's no doubt about it. It's going to take longer than 5 years, for that matter. So we have the kind of research phase that we talked about. That often takes about a year. We have the kind of the rallying of a coalition to act on the research, which takes another 6 to 12 months, to kind of depending on a lot of things. And then our grant cycles typically run 3 years. And from what we've seen, after 3 years, we can see kind of a marked change in the kind of sustained growth and sustainability of our grantees.
Great. I want to stay on Indiana by going to Mary Johnson's question here. Mary, do you want to come off mute, or I can read it?
Sure. Yep.
Go
yeah.
ahead.
So I live in New England, which may shape this question. As we look as a local funder at where we might put together a group of stewards, there is some concern that the news outlets here that are nonprofit news tend to be viewed as a little bit left of center. And so I'm curious, when you were putting together your stewards list, were you identifying people across the political spectrum, or is this right? Does it carry a point of view that would align with one side of the aisle or the other?
Yeah. So we think it's essential to build a broad coalition that does include a diversity in kind of political ideology, in addition to kind of every other sense of the word. So I think the kind of through line, kind of building off of what Lauren said, is you have to, for this to work and for this to make sense in our view, for philanthropy to focus on, more and more people need to see themselves represented in and served by local news. Therefore, we can't, kind of carry the way, all the ways that it's been done in the past. And I think building a politically diverse coalition is a part of that as well.
Kevin, do you want to chime in a little bit about that in the context of Indiana?
Yeah, so Indiana's a conservative leaning state, as you probably know, and we're not like off the, we're not off the tracks compared to some other states. I mean, it's still a reasonable, rational discussion there about things. But a lot of the high net worth individuals who are supporting this effort, I would identify them as Republicans. I think that public news service, has no identifiable ideological bent. I mean, I think both Capital B and the Central Indiana, Indianapolis newsroom are going to cover the communities, differently than they've been covered before. And you're going to see perspectives and people reflected who've never seen themselves in the news. Is that liberal or conservative? I don't know, but I do think it's long overdue. And I think that the people who are supporting the initiative actually agree, they agree with that. They're not, State House file, it's college students covering the legislature again. I don't think that you could put any sort of ideological spin on that. So I think we've, I will say Karen Fusen, who is driving the effort locally, is very conscious of politics and appearances and things like that. And I feel like the initiative has been carefully managed to navigate what you're asking about. I mean, so we feel good about it. I don't think anybody would describe it as either left or right. It's just better local news and information.
That's great to hear. Thank you.
I'd like to turn to Lori's question, which is a question for Lauren. Lori, if you want to go off mute, feel free.
Sure. Lauren, you talked about some of your assumptions going in about what fundraising would be like and differences between raising money for your operation in Indiana versus Gary. And I'm really curious to hear more details, what lessons you might share with us, or what insights that you have about raising money for news coverage of smaller, perhaps lower income and or more rural communities.
I think it's well, I don't know if I have sort of takeaways wrapped in a bow. I think my assumption was that one would be maybe more difficult than the other, and I think it's all kind of difficult. But that maybe it's not easier to do it in a larger city where there has the appearance of more philanthropic funding. I think raising money for local news is difficult. Period. And but I think my a lesson is just when it's a smaller community, and but I think particular when it's a lower income community, is that we're not raising money from our audience really at Capital B, and maybe that will happen at some point, but that's not happening quite yet. And I think, one of the things that we're launching this week, actually, the Capital B Black Local News Fund, a sort of a centralized fund where we are raising money just for current and future local newsrooms, not any specific local newsrooms. So people around the country, anywhere, who care about local news, who care about not necessarily place-based, but the actual mission of local news and want to support our local newsrooms are able to donate to the fund to support them. And, we're just trying to think of really, interesting ways for folks to support the mission without it necessarily being about only specific communities, because, we want to find ways to sort of spread the mission and spread the wealth outside of just the small communities where there might not be as many people necessarily interested in that specific place.
If I could,
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
So from our experience, but more importantly from the experience of the 41 organizations in the AJP portfolio, I might highlight two elements to this. So one is there are really exciting models that I think are a really great place to start in communities where there isn't a upfront influx of philanthropy. The Documenters program created by City Bureau out of Chicago kind of comes to mind as a way to really authentically engage community members, but also to do kind of local government accountability work where residents are trained and paid to go to public meetings, document those meetings, and kind of create more original local information than existed before in ways that doesn't require millions of dollars of investment by any stretch. The second trend, I would say, and one that has kind of been really encouraging to me in the last couple of years, is we're finding that individuals and foundations, are open to funding other areas of the state they are in, acknowledging that everyone votes in the same state government elections. Policy affects everyone. And I remember speaking to a donor in Cleveland, who I was talking to about supporting Signal Cleveland. He said to me, "You're talking to me about Signal Cleveland, but you should be talking to me about Signal Appalachia," and which doesn't exist. But I took his point. So I do think we do as a field, as a community, have to advance the argument that we have to make sure that local news exists for everyone in kind of rural communities and smaller communities.
Thank you. I'm going to let Courtney come off mute for our final question, and then I will turn this back to Vince to close us out. So Courtney.
Thank you. So a few of you have talked about the landscape survey you did to kind of figure out where to focus, but who did you focus that survey at? Was it at the public, journalists, civic leaders, and sort of what were some of the major takeaways out of that pointed you in a specific direction or on a focus or anything? Was there anything that really surprised you where you're like, whoa, we didn't see that one coming?
Sure. So I think, so to speak to a bit about the methodology, the focus, so I mentioned before we spoke to nearly 1,000 Hoosiers, maybe 50 of those were journalists. So very much want to, speak with experts who have so much context about the ecosystem, but primarily speak to residents who, are our stakeholders primarily, and what they want to see and what they need from local news and information. We have a couple of different ways that we approach the work. So, knowing that for different communities, language barriers, internet barriers are an impediment to kind of really surfacing their news and information needs. So there's kind of intentionality around hiring community ambassadors in communities we know peer-to-peer outreach is going to be essential. So that's a little bit about the mindset we use for the research. If you are interested in learning more about that, our director of community listening, Fiona Morgan, is a really great resource who has spent many years thinking about the best ways to do this. And I know she's been involved in several of the projects that we've talked about today. I think in terms of what we found, one is just there is not apathy in Indiana. Was really encouraging to see that people have noticed the decline in local news and they want it back. That came through very clearly in the focus group. A lot of what Lauren mentioned about news in Gary in particular, feeling like it's too much out of Chicago. Some of the ships Kevin mentioned. And I think, folks were raising their hands to kind of support more and have more and really want not only the kind of accountability coverage that we know is missing, but also, see themselves represented and just tell the everyday stories that kind of allow for building empathy with their neighbors and get more out of the place they live.
Thanks,
Awesome,
Michael. This conversation really is coming at a really amazing moment for our field. And Press Forward's been mentioned several times. Kevin just mentioned it in the chat, but $500 million of collaborative funding has come together from 22 national funders, and including Lumina Foundation. And I think this is an important step to catalyze more philanthropy from journalism. And ultimately, local journalism is a local issue, and local philanthropists are going to be a really important part of ushering in the future of local news. So we are very eager to have conversations with folks about what you're thinking about in your community. If you're interested in any of the 41 organizations we invest in, we work super closely with. So we're always happy to take phone calls and talk about either investments that we've made or communities and how we're working with. So I'll drop my email in the chat. I'm sure my colleague Michael will as well. Vince, I will hand this over to you, but thank you all for the time.
Thank you, the whole panel, but especially Sarabeth for excellent moderation of this discussion. I think a lot of us have heard about AJP and its work, but maybe haven't had this kind of in-depth introduction to just how you work with partners in places. And it's really wonderful to really have a deeper understanding of that. I'll acknowledge that in addition to Kevin's note about Kathy M., I see that she has been signed on for this too. So thank you, Kathy, for all your work on Press Forward and for your past service on our board, among other things, but for listening in as well. Great to see you there. And if anybody wants to connect with her, we can help you do that too. I will say, if you haven't had enough of this excellent moderation from Sarabeth Berman, you can have more of this experience. She's going to be with us at our annual gathering of journalism funders at the Ford Foundation, October 11 and 12. We'll post a link there. But I also want to just echo what Kevin Corcoran has said, which is you might think, oh, that's a gathering of journalism funders. We're not really journalism funders. We fund a little journalism on the side. Everybody's welcome. Everybody's invited. And most of the people involved in funding journalism don't have a dedicated program on journalism. Maybe someday they'll make it to that, as was the case with the Joyce Foundation. But we're really a big tent, and most of the people who are involved in this are finding their way to do more and better, and not just the Knight, MacArthur, and Ford Foundations who have a dedicated program in this area, but also everyone else too. So hopefully we'll see you all again soon, either on our monthly call on Monday or in person at the Ford Foundation. And if you can't make it to New York, there is a live streaming option for that too. So thank you all for your participation. It's great to see so many people, especially MIF board members who signed in. Thank you all for that. And
Thanks so much. And as you're logging off, go to capitalb.org and sign up for their newsletter.
Great idea.
Bye,
capitalbnews.org.
We'll post all the links.
capitalbnews.org. Thank you. Capital B
We'll
News.
post all the links in follow-up to this as well. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.